Basically, the county supervisors were authorizing a company to come in and build a solar power plant on top of not a battlefield, but a historic site where the winter encampments were for one of the armies during the Civil War. And what the preservationists want is for this to be at least delayed until historical surveys are done so that they can find out if there's something that needs to be preserved there. And our roundtable board voted to send support for that. The idea being that at least don't build on this site until you know if there's something you're destroying, because there's reason to believe that there's historical material that has not been fully explored there. Other roundtables around the country are doing similar things, and we're hoping that they will at least postpone the building of the solar power facility until it can be determined if there's a reason to hold off, and if there's real reason to hold off on building it, to at least postpone or possibly cancel the project or move it slightly so that they won't be destroying part of the history of the war. Because it's not just the battle, it's where the soldiers were living and how they were living. And that's what this particular conflict is about. Don't destroy that till you figure out what you're destroying. So that's going on right now, and we'll be sending out more about it in the next issue of the call and in upcoming emails to you for those who get our messages. Now, our speaker for tonight, I think, has an unusual distinction because if I've counted correctly, he's authored or co-authored a book for every year since he got his PhD.
Could be.
It's because it looks like 30 in 33 years.
Human presence, of course, is kids in the cities and planets. The game is it gay?
We're getting a little extra.
I'm trying to catch them. Give me a moment. They're just coming in randomly here.
Okay.
All right.
I'm not able to hear. Okay. Well, hi. Okay. You ready for me to start now, or?
Sure.
Okay. I was listening to the introduction, and then the sound broke up on me.
We were getting some background feed in there, Steve, and I was trying to be able to individually mute them. So I don't know, Nick, were you done with the introduction, or are we ready for Steve, or do we need to?
Oh, well, you can go ahead and start, because that was the key issue I wanted to ask was, how can you be so prolific as a working professor?
Well, some of those books were written when I was younger. I'm not making as good a progress now as I did then. But I guess partially it's fun, and that helps me to get on quickly. So I enjoy what I do. Let me go ahead and this is a little new. Let me go ahead and share my slide presentation. Okay. All right. You should now be able to see my my slide presentation there, and it's not really the slide I wanted to start with, so hang on a second. Okay. There, that's better. Now it starts on the one I wanted to see. Good. That's more like it. Well, this is kind of a new experience for us. I mean, somewhat new. By now, we've all been to a bunch of Zoom meetings and Microsoft Teams and GoToMeeting and WebEx. And so this is getting to be old hat in one sense, but it's also kind of new. For me, watching the Zoom meetings and GoToMeeting meetings and what have you is not as strange as it is to sit here and talk into my computer. But I'm gradually getting used to that now. I mean, talking to myself is one thing, but talking to my computer, that's really weird. It's good to sort of see all of you again, at least either a few faces and a lot of initials. I've been out there to Pasadena a couple times to talk to you all, and so this is third time, so it's you all are all friends. It's good to see you all. And then I know there's some, at least one visitor. My student Nathan Provost is out there. Is tuned in. So hi, Nathan. And I don't know but what Jonathan Steplick, a former student of mine, might have tuned in too. And if he did, and even if he didn't, actually, he's one of the authors on the book, Vicksburg Besieged. And I'll probably mention his chapter as I go along, just in passing. Well, anyway, when Mike contacted me about possibly speaking this fall, I thought of this topic because this book had just come out, and it's another volume in our Civil War Campaigns in the West series. It's sponsored in part by the Bridge Street History Center in Granbury, Texas, and the series is, and we're continuing to publish volumes of essays on major campaigns in the Western theater. And this, of course, the Vicksburg campaign is a very big campaign and actually lasted for months. And the siege was maybe the most famous aspect of that campaign, the last 6 weeks. And so that's what this volume is dedicated to. The idea is that in a volume like this, the individual essays, we could go into specific aspects of the campaign and explore them in a little more depth than you would in even a great big fat multi-volume history of the campaign. And so we hope that it brings out and sheds some light on some of these things. Now, my chapter and the topic of my talk this evening is going to be, well, I titled it Nights at Vicksburg. It seemed there was almost no way to title this that didn't bring snickers. While we were discussing it editorially, Chuck Greer and I were discussing it, and we talked about Vicksburg Nights or Nights at Vicksburg or whatever, nocturnal action during the siege. We're talking about what went on during the siege on the battlefield at night. And so I'll just advance here. Now, this, of course, is the famous Kurtz and Allison illustration that we use on the cover of the book, on the dust jacket. And you know, those Kurtz and Allison illustrations, they're notoriously stilted and inaccurate, and yet we like them and we use them. It's not the way the war was, but sometimes it's the way we like to see it pictured. It does show you a little bit of the idea of the siege. You can see those baskets there. Maybe you can see my little pointer there. Those things that look like baskets, actually gabions, made by driving the stakes into the ground, weaving the thinner withes through them, and maybe flexible branches through them, and then pulling the stakes up out of the ground. You've got a round sort of basket thing that you can stuff full of dirt. Gabions fulfilled the role in the Civil War and earlier wars that was largely taken over by sandbags during the wars of the 20th century, and I suppose even to the present. They would fill them with dirt, and it's just something to hold the dirt up there to stop bullets. But this is a daytime picture of the siege, and most of the pictures you see of the siege are daytime. Here's a somewhat more realistic, or at least more of an effort at realism was made in this picture. A sketch, an artist's sketch of the battle of the Vicksburg Crater, which happened there on June 25th. Troops, after Logan's division had dug their approach trench quite close to the Confederate works, they were able to tunnel under them, tunnel under the Confederate works, set off a mine which blasted a crater in the side of the Confederate fort there on that hill. And then under the cover of Union sharpshooters, you can see behind these lines that they built here, Union sharpshooters trying to keep the Confederate defenders down. Logan's troops charged up the approach trench and into the crater, tried to fight their way into the fort. It didn't succeed for them. It was a hard and bloody fight, but they were not able to battle their way through. The mining operation and the sapping operation there against the crater is the topic of Justin Solinek's chapter in the book, Vicksburg Besieged. You see pictures of this. but that's not a night action. And then this one is a little dark. The picture's a little dark, but it's not really a night picture. Of course, you may recognize that as an artist's depiction of the famous makeshift wooden tower called Coonskin's Tower that was used by a Union sharpshooter nicknamed Coonskin during the siege, as he tried to pick off, snipe would be the 20th century word, Confederate defenders there in their lines. And the fact, you know, one thing would occur to you pretty quickly, the fact that he was, you know, Union soldiers and Coonskin himself were able to erect that wooden tower is evidence that the Confederate artillery was almost completely suppressed, at least during the daytime at Vicksburg, because artillery would have been able to knock that down very quickly. That didn't happen because the Union artillery had thoroughly suppressed Confederate artillery fire. Sharpshooting in general, and of course including Coonskin, the famous sharpshooter, was the topic of Jonathan Steplett's chapter in the book Vicksburg Besieged. But that's daytime action, that's not nighttime action. It's hard to find a good picture of nighttime action, but this is your lucky day. I found one. So you'll have to study that carefully now. I know there's a lot going on in this picture. You know, the really great thing about doing this by an online meeting like this is that I can't hear all of you not laughing out there. Well, I'm here all week, folks. No, really, seriously. How about a real picture of what might be a night scene at Vicksburg? Actually, this may not have been intended as a night scene, but an early morning scene. But you can tell it gives the idea of a night scene. You can see hilly terrain, you can see trenches, you can see some soldiers vaguely and some silhouetted against the sky. This would be kind of dangerous potentially if it wasn't. I think that this is supposed to depict the Confederates coming out to surrender. That gives you a little bit of the idea of a night scene. Well, rather than showing you actual scenes of night fighting, let me show you some scenes of things that happened in the daytime that also happened, although in different ways and in different degrees, in the nighttime. You can see here soldiers lined up along the parapet in entrenchments. Obviously, the artist has made these entrenchments a little more formal than I think they really were, and a little more roomy than they really were. But you can tell that this really is at Vicksburg because you've got Coonskin's Tower in the background. However, I don't really think Coonskin flew a great big flag over his tower, but the artist couldn't resist. So shooting went on a lot during the day. One soldier who was in the siege said that the sound of the constant firing of soldiers sharpshooting at each other during the siege sounded like a bunch of men at a chopping bee. So imagine if a bunch of men came over to your farm to help you get in your firewood for the winter. Maybe you were behind, so a bunch of your neighbors came over and they're all chopping away, chopping up logs or splitting logs, splitting chunks of firewood. And that's what he said. It sounded like the constant clatter of firing during the day. Well, firing went on during the nighttime, somewhat to a lesser degree. You could often hear both small arms and cannon fire during the night. Now, something that went on, so the firing went on in the night, but less. And of course, what firing did take place at night was less accurate, but not necessarily always completely inaccurate. On the other hand, digging, the digging of approach trenches went on at night to an even greater degree than during the daytime. It was safer at night. The darkness provided additional cover. But the troops still had to use devices such as you see here to cover them while digging these approach trenches at night. Now, the night digging had to be done by moonlight. You're not going to bring a lantern out there. That would absolutely make a target of you, and that would just be asking to be shot. So no candles or lanterns in the lines, please. No fires. So it's only by moonlight. One soldier wrote that in one particular night they were only able to get in 3 hours of digging because you had to have moonlight. With that moonlight, though, you had to have cover. Now, what you see with these soldiers here and is they're digging an approach trench, or a sap, as it was called, and you have here what is a sap roller. Now, this sap roller looks like a very big, sort of oversized fascine. A fascine is a bundle of sticks or small logs, and you can see it's bound together there by sort of a wicker arrangement, such as they use for fascines and gabions. I think this is a fascine because it's filling as sticks rather than dirt. And they were, but because it's oversized and because it's being used for this purpose, it's called a sap roller. So they would roll this along in front of it. So they're going to dig the trench further to the front and roll that along in front of them. That will provide them cover, they hope, at least mostly, from small arms fire from the front. Now, if the rebels could hit it with a cannonball, that would be good, but they probably can't. So they're covered from small arms fire. Now you can see over here on the side, they're piling up a ridge of dirt. These two soldiers are apparently doing their digging. They're piling the dirt up there. You notice they've got it piled up against the sap roller, and as they roll that roller out a little farther, they're going to pile up more dirt there. Now I'm going to say this is a photograph, but I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to say I think this photograph is staged. Okay, I think it's posed. First of all, it's not at Vicksburg, but it does depict a process that went on at Vicksburg. And second, I think it's staged. I don't think they are under enemy fire. I don't think they're anywhere within sight of the enemy. For a number of reasons, they're a little too nonchalant. But also consider if this ridge of earth is required for cover against enemy bullets, well, yes, some people are standing up a little bit too tall, but also look at where the camera is. I suppose maybe it could be one of those unwritten rules of war. You don't shoot the cameraman who's taking picture. No, that's not true. They didn't have that rule at all. As far as I'm concerned, there's no rule about swinging on 3-0, and I don't care how many runs you're up. Excuse me, that's just a little baseball quip there, but it's not the batter's job to stop the batter from hitting the ball. That's the pitcher's job. So that was the thing that happened in baseball recently. But no, I don't think they had an unwritten rule about shooting cameramen. So I think this one is staged, but it does show you kind of what it looked like to dig a sap, an approach trench, farther. Now, another thing that they did with approach trenches is, as far as possible, they tried to lay them out, usually in somewhat of a zigzag pattern. It depended on the exact lie of the land, and it depended also on where the enemy was and what his angles of fire were. You didn't want to give your enemy a clear shot into the trench, and definitely not down the length of it. This trench is rather shallow, I might add. I would like a deeper one if I was going to be in it. Here's a close-up of a gabion. Again, it's the same kind of sort of wicker-like situation of a bunch of sticks hollow on the inside. They would fill that with dirt. Here they're using one of those as a sap roller. I guess they felt like they didn't need the dirt and there was enough sticks to stop it. So here's, again, an artist's depiction of a sap roller. Again, the sap at the head. This is called the head of sap, the end of the sap, and it's the end closest to the enemy. There's the sap roller. You've got it braced up. There's a couple of sappers, soldiers detailed to dig a sap, and they're digging out there, getting closer and closer to enemy lines. They've got some gabions piled up here with dirt in them, and it looks like they've got some sandbags on top too. Now they want to do this at night rather than in the daytime because it's safer at night. And this is an episode from the Vicksburg Siege, actually, although the artist's depiction is correct in concept, but some of his dimensions are all wrong. One place along the lines during the siege, some of the soldiers they found an abandoned railroad flat car, and the Union soldiers, and they rigged that flat car. Now, railroad cars were not as big then. We're talking an 1860s railroad car, so that's not as big as a railroad car today, which you wouldn't hoist around. But they got that railroad flat car up there. Now, in the picture, it is much too wide. Railroad flat cars are not that wide. But anyway, they got the flat car up there at the head of sap, and they piled cotton bales on it. Again, the dimensions are all wrong here, but it gives you the idea. They had a railroad flat car piled high with cotton bales, which they rolled in front of them as a sort of a super sap roller. The Confederates didn't know how to stop it, and night after night, for several nights, it seemed to be the unstoppable sap roller, getting and providing very good cover for sappers as they got closer and closer. What the Confederates eventually did, they took their mini-A balls, and as you know, a mini-A ball, it's a Civil War bullet. It's got a hollow at the base of it. And they took little cotton wads soaked in alcohol and stuffed those in the base of their mini-A balls, and were able to load them that way and fire them. And apparently that was able to carry, apparently the suction of the mini-A ball passing through the air maybe, that was able to carry shards of burning cotton into the cotton bales on the sap roller, which eventually succeeded in setting fire to the sap roller, and hence caused it to burn up. And the Union sappers had to take cover very hurriedly. Okay. I don't want to go to that yet. Let's keep it on that picture next. So yeah, digging saps at night. And sometimes you would come under fire, and sometimes they would actually advance a line of infantry out into no man's land in the dark to cover the sappers against a possible sort of trench raid on the Confederate side. I didn't know to go down there. Now, another thing that happened a lot at night, and probably not at all during the daytime, was, well, I use the word, I think technically the military would be fraternization. Now, I start to use that word, and it can conjure up all kinds of fraternization, again, such as might arouse snickers. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about Union and Confederate troops meeting in no man's land to talk and trade. And this went on a lot, and it was mentioned a lot. One Union soldier, the 8th Illinois, said that was shooting with a vengeance all day and talk it over at night. Another Union soldier, the 25th Iowa, said, we talk friendly at night and shoot at each other all day. It's a strange thing about this war that, you know, in the Eastern Theater, say, you know, Virginia had been shooting each other, you know, a couple, 2-3 weeks before, and they might meet on either side of the Rapidan River, say, and talk to each other across the river. But here, you know, they were shooting each other that day, and they're going to be shooting each other again the next day, and they meet in no man's land and talk. They might exchange newspapers, which is really something military authorities frowned on because it was a very severe breach of security. You might exchange, like maybe trade a knife for something else, or trade tobacco for coffee was a famous trade that soldiers made. The Confederates tended to have a good supply of tobacco. The Yankees tended to have a good supply of coffee, and they traded accordingly. On one occasion, a Union soldier gave the Confederates he was conversing with, or several Union soldiers gave the Confederates they were conversing with hardtack, because the Confederates didn't have food. Well, that was definitely something that gave an advantage to the Confederates, because hunger was one of the things that Union forces were trying to use. Only one of the things, though, to try to lure the Confederates out. Probably didn't make a big difference, though. A few pieces of hardtack, one way or the other, probably wasn't that significant. One Ohio soldier, a soldier of the 54th Ohio, got something that surprised him. He didn't have to trade for it. It was just handed to him. He was discussing with the Confederates there in no man's land, and they said, well, what regiment are you with? I was with the 54th Ohio. You were in Shiloh, weren't you? Yeah, we were. So they asked his name, and told him his name, and the Confederate dug in his knapsack, pulled out a photograph. And it was a photograph of the Ohio soldier's sweetheart that had been in his tent at Shiloh when the Confederates overran the camp. This Confederate soldier had carried off the picture of his sweetheart, and so the Ohio soldier got a picture of his girlfriend back. So that was good. Not quite as shocking as that, but a soldier of the 15th Illinois from Lake County, Illinois, actually from Waukegan, Illinois, which is up there north of Chicago, kind of between Chicago and Wisconsin. He was just talking with some Confederates at the 52nd Georgia. that the 52nd Georgia was raised in the southern part of the state of Georgia, which is a long way from Waukegan, but he found out that some of those soldiers had relatives who lived in Lake County, Illinois. And this soldier said he knew he had an uncle who lived in Georgia, and he thought, afterwards, he thought I might have been talking to my uncle and not have known it. So interesting sort of exchanges went on during the nighttime. This could not happen in the daytime. You stuck your head or your hand over the breastworks in the daytime, you ran a good chance of getting a shot. But at night, something like this could happen. Sometimes, though, the exchanges in no man's land during the nighttime could turn hostile. A soldier of the 76th Ohio talked about one night, the lines had grown pretty close together, and by the end of the siege, they were very close together. So the 76th Ohio on the one side and a Confederate regiment, he couldn't remember which one, on the other side, or at least he didn't write down which one. And they were not far apart, you know, actually within speaking distance of each other on their separate parapets. A lot of talking went back and forth. In this case, they didn't really go out into no man's land, but they did climb up out of their trenches. The guys were lying down on top of the parapet or reclining on the glacis. So they were not taking cover. They couldn't have been in those positions during the daytime, but they were not really exactly in no man's land, at least not very far. They were exposed. They would have been, had they been there during the daytime, exposed to enemy's fire. And each side had one soldier who was rather glib and perhaps clever-tongued, and they were the two spokesman guys were doing most of the talking. They sometimes got into kind of a contest of derogatory, or at least somewhat in good fun, derogatory quips toward each other. It's sort of like Bears fans and Packers fans exchanging greetings. Maybe not quite like that. No, that they would be shooting then. You know, well, maybe like TCU fans and Oklahoma fans. Yeah, not TCU fans and Baylor fans. That would be, you know, more to the knife. But we'll say like TCU fans and Oklahoma fans exchanging some quips and remarks across no man's land. Well, the Ohio spokesman got a little too pointed and maybe a little inappropriate with one of the remarks he made. The chronicler who wrote it down, the soldier who wrote it down, didn't record what the guy said or even the meaning of it. Said maybe you got a little out of line with that comment. I don't know if that bears at all on like what constitutes acceptable joking in different parts of the country. I know that there are differences as I've been around different parts of the country, and maybe that was what was going on there. At any rate, it didn't set well with the rebels. The fellow had just made that rather pointed comment, and a cannon went off in the rebel lines and sent a load of canister flying just over the heads of the Union soldiers lounging atop their parapet. Maybe the cannon was deliberately aimed high. We don't really know. But the guys quickly tumbled back into their trench. The load of canister had gone by before, but had it been aimed a little lower, it could have killed a number of men. So apparently they didn't think that was any joking matter. Sometimes the fraternization would blend over into the issue of digging saps farther across the lines. Sometimes it would occur, especially as the siege went on and the saps got closer to the Confederate defenses, that they were within plain sight. Even at night, even in pale moonlight, there was enough light that they could see where the Yankees were and that they were digging closer and closer across no man's land. And there were times when Confederate soldiers clearly just sat and watched and did nothing and let them get closer. So a clear case of demoralization and letting them dig closer. But these kind of nighttime truces would generally go on until Confederate officers came along. these truces generally favored the Union. If neither side was shooting, the Union side, which did not really want to shoot right then, they wanted to dig, they could go on digging. So whatever was going on, if there was no shooting, it was to the favor of the Union besiegers, not in the favor of the Confederate defenders. For that reason, Confederate officers, when they would come along, they would put a stop to this right away and demand that the troops get back in the trenches. Occasionally, a Union officer would decide that this shouldn't be going on. People who were enemies should be enemies at night, too. So he would order them to get back in their trenches and start shooting. But the troops would yell a warning to each other before they did that. They'd yell, "Look out, Rebs, we're going to shoot." So the other guys could take cover. They would not take unfair advantage of it. Well, sometimes the demoralization of the Confederates in their lines would extend to, and during the fraternization, would extend to the point of deserting. Now, there were a number of reasons why Confederates might desert. You can obviously think of some of them. One thing is they didn't necessarily have enough food to eat. They were not actually starving to death. There were still food stocks in Vicksburg when the place surrendered. But they were definitely on short rations. They were definitely hungry. And that doesn't improve your mood. They were taking in their belt a notch or two. This would be a weight loss program, but not the kind you want. So that would make them unhappy. They were going hungry. They were trapped in the city here. Now, their morale at being trapped had been quite high when the initial Union assaults were made in May, the May 19 and 22 assaults. But as the siege dragged on, Confederate morale seemed to flag. I would almost posit that one of the factors, besides the fact that they were cooped up there, besides the fact that they were running out of, well, not exactly running out, but they were on short rations. I think another factor is the just steady, seemingly inexorable approach of the Union sappers and the Union troops getting closer, Union lines getting closer and closer and closer. And I think the feeling that they simply could not stop these Union troops from getting closer. And by the way, with formal siege warfare, that is the way it is. Formal siege warfare, as it was practiced in the 18th and 19th century, and Vicksburg was one of the last formal sieges, maybe the last, I don't know, where approaches by what were called regular approaches were used, was invented by a guy named Vauban, a French general named Vauban. And he worked it all out, he had it figured out to a T in the early 18th century, as far as what you should do as far as besieging people. And he knew how to build really good forts, but he knew that the besieger would always win. The besieger would always be successful and would always take the fort if you give him time. There's no relieving army that comes and breaks the siege, lifts the siege, the besieging army will get in there. And I think that helped to demoralize Confederates. So there was a steady trickle of demoralization. One soldier wrote that 3 Confederates came into his regiment within a single night. It was probably a especially good night, but there was a steady trickle of Confederates deserting to Union lines. But there also were clashes at night. Sometimes peaceful digging in the saps would give way to fighting, and fraternization would give way to fighting. This became more and more the case as the Union saps got closer and closer to the Confederate lines. By the end of the siege, by July 3rd, Union saps were, for the most part, separated, and Union siege lines had been advanced. They were separated from the Confederates only by the thickness of the Confederate parapet. So, the glassy parapet and rear slope of the Confederate works. So we're talking, just maybe 5-10 yards from where the rebels are, if that much. So it's very close by that time. Now, it's not quite that close by, say, the 3rd week of June, 4th week of June, but it's getting closer and closer. And this leads to some difficulties at night and some combat actions at night. Troops of the 33rd Wisconsin were facing Confederates of the 1st Missouri Confederate Regiment. The 1st Missouri Confederate was part of one of really the best Confederate brigade in the Vicksburg garrison. And they were, you know, they had some pride, and they felt like they had been getting the worst of the sharpshooting battles with the 33rd Wisconsin during the daytime. So they got angry, and they shouted that they were going to get the 33rd that night, and sure enough, they charged, and a very spirited battle took place between them that night. But the 33rd was able to hang on to its position in the saps and fight them off. But there was a battle that took place just because of some anger over something that happened during the day and a desire to retaliate for that. But you couldn't retaliate in the daytime because you'd just be mowed down. An interesting exchange took place between the 46th Indiana and the Confederate defenders opposite it. 46th Indiana was in the 13th Corps, which by that time was under the command of General Edward O.C. Ord. And as the siege neared its end, the 46th, like other regiments along that line, was getting very close to the Confederate lines. One night, as they were digging closer and closer, and they were clearly within conversational distance of the Confederate pickets. Now, the Confederate pickets are deployed in front of the Confederate battle line. As they were digging further and further and closer, a Confederate officer came out and ordered the Union troops to stop digging and go back to their lines. Well, they didn't take orders from Confederate officers, so they kept digging. He repeated the order and repeated it again, and then finally said that if they did not stop digging and go back to their lines, the Confederates would open fire. They continued digging, and the officer then ordered all of his pickets to come back into his main line. Now, that was the obvious immediate prelude to the Confederates opening fire. The Indiana sappers and pickets recognized this, and so they retreated on their main line. And the two lines now well within musket shot of each other, and I too mean musket shot. They're armed rifles, but they're close enough now. They're close, and they eye each other in the moonlight over the sights of their Enfields and Springfields, but nobody shoots. And they have this standoff. Presently, the Confederate pickets come back out and take their positions in no man's land, and the Union pickets go back out. Again, it's a very cooperative endeavor. Maybe the Union sappers want to move their sap in a particular direction, and they're going to have to dig through a place where a Confederate's picket is standing. Excuse us, could you move, please? We'd like to dig there. Oh, sure, that's okay. And he goes over somewhere else, and they keep right on digging. This went on another night. They're getting closer still. And the Confederate officer comes out again and orders them out. Again, they refuse. Again, he orders them out. Again, they man their trenches. And this time, the Confederates actually fired a volley. And the Union troops shoot back, and there was another exchange of fire. In this case, it's a nighttime, really a firefight. There was the second fight. There was no charge, no crossing of bayonets or anything, but a lot of shooting, not probably particularly accurate shooting, but a lot of shooting. But it was brought on by the desire of that Confederate officer to prevent a Union sap from being dug right up to the base of his parapet, which is what was going to happen and what finally did happen. You can't blame him for that because it was really his duty. So that could happen. And then there's the amazing experience of Michael Haffey, a soldier in Company C of the 33rd Wisconsin. This happened to him in late June, so by this time the lines were very close together. Again, there was the situation where sappers were sometimes being fired on by the rebels, or else there was the threat of firing on them, or possibly of a trench raid. So Haffey's company, Company C, was told off to deploy to no man's land to cover the digging parties, the sapping parties. So they got out there into no man's land, and of course it's dark, so they're standing erect, actually. They're standing in line, and I think the officer, the captain, was trying to figure out where they should go. Now, Haffey's position in the line happened to be the extreme left hand, and for whatever reason, their commander had them deployed in single file line rather than in the double file normal line of battle. But there they were, standing there in no man's land, single file line. Lines are very close together, so it's not far to the Confederate lines. Haffey's just there, he's by himself. There's nobody on his left, just darkness out there. He hears his officer yell or shout the command, left face, and then double time march. At least he thought he heard that. He went trotting off. There's no one else around. Everybody's behind him, right? The whole company is following behind him, he hopes. And he trots along through the dark, very bad visibility, and he trips over something. Something trips him, and he falls down. He falls up at the base of an embankment, and just at that point, on the side of the embankment above him, a gun port opens. Apparently the Confederates had used maybe some very thick planking over their gun fort in their the embrasure in their earthworks. Anyway, this opens up, a cannon muzzle appears and is immediately fired. He said the concussion lifted him off the ground, and I can well imagine. He said that by the time he was able to get his wits together and think, and under the circumstances, that might have been a while, cannon were returning fire from Union side. And remember, they're not that far apart. And cannonballs are hitting the earthen embankment, the parapet against which he's rolled up. He's actually in the ditch of the Confederate fort. He realized that what had tripped him was some telegraph wire that the Confederates strung between posts there to try to trip attackers, and it worked on him. He is, I think, understandably rather rattled in the midst of this, and he insisted that he thought that one of the Union cannonballs, his own side cannonballs, had actually passed between his legs as he was standing there and hit the Confederate parapet. I'm a little skeptical of that, but maybe it happened. Anyway, Haffey was able to crawl and scoot and slide down the slope that remained of no man's land and into his own side's trenches. The colonel of the 33rd Wisconsin wanted to know where his company C, and Haffey didn't know, and what happened, and why aren't you with them? And Haffey explained. So the colonel told the major to go with Haffey, and he tells Haffey, go back to the last place where you saw the regiment. So Haffey goes back to the last place where he saw the regiment, where he got that order, left face, double quick march, or he thought he did. And the regiment, and the company rather, the company C is still right there. They hadn't moved. Haffey maybe imagined the order or something. And anyway, he had gone off on this lone nighttime jaunt across no man's land and narrowly missed being blown to pieces by a Confederate cannon. So there could be scary times out in no man's land at night, and there could be friendly conversations, there could be trade, Confederates surrendering, especially more and more as the end of the siege got closer. Confederates showed definite signs of demoralization. And I think if there's anything to be gathered from looking at the experience of what went on, the soldiers' experience during the nighttime, and what went on during the night times there at Vicksburg, it's that the process of the siege helped to demoralize the Confederates. The approach of Union soldiers. This is not exactly a bayonet charge, but if any of you have read the writings of the British military historian Paddy Griffith, the idea that the physical approach of a hostile enemy, someone trying to kill you, who gets closer and closer, is demoralizing. And it seems to have demoralized the Confederates because there was an increased rate of desertion. There was also really a refusal to do duty, or at least in the absence of direct supervision of an officer, the soldiers would not do their duty and defend their position, and otherwise, not in many cases, not being ready to resist. Of course, that was not true of all of them. There's plenty of fight in the 1st Missouri, and I'm sure in some of the other units too. But it's interesting that we don't have really pictures much, and we don't really hear much about the nighttime at the siege of Vicksburg, but that's where the biggest progress was made. Well, okay, I'm gonna stop sharing that tab, and I'm going to go back over here where I can see you all. And I think if there's time left in the meeting, does anyone have a question you would like to ask?
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and unmute everybody here. When I do that, you may have to unmute locally to be able to ask a question. There was one question that Janet had posed in the chat area.
That's around Vicksburg.
Janet posed a question for you and said, what was the experience like for Vicksburg civilians during the nights in the cave shelters?
It was bad. It was rough. So what would have been the most disturbing military action for civilians would be the fire of the mortars. There were mortars along the Union siege lines. There were also mortars from boats deployed in the river, and they kept up their fire at night. People said that watching the fire of the mortars at night was very pretty. It was delightful. You'd see that fiery fuse of the mortar working up in a parabola through the sky. It was pretty if you were not anywhere near the target. And of course, the civilians would have been. They would have been sheltering in their caves and hoping they didn't get a direct hit. So, yeah, a little scary, for sure.
Just one thought in regards to the Gabions as well. Let me go ahead and share this here. You had mentioned the Gabions, and you said that they're today they have sandbags for those. Actually, Gabions are still in use. These are ones in Afghanistan that they've used, and they're still using them. They have different materials. They're not using wicker baskets, but the Gabions is still there. You can see Gabions here underneath of sandbags for that. But Gabions are still a great part of warfare. And they also use
Playing golf.
Yeah, they also use them for other things. You see that they're using them here as retaining walls for sides of construction areas and things. So Gabions have actually been around since the time of Caesar. They've actually have a huge long history in there.
Yeah, very good. Well, I don't pay attention to what happens to them after the Civil War, but that's huge. Hi, Michael.
We took a trip down the Mississippi back, I think it was 2014, 18, and we stopped at Vicksburg, had a tour of the battlefield, which is primarily the Union side of all the monuments of the various regiments from Ohio, Indiana, Michigan. I'm assuming that these trenches were pretty much on the southwest side of Vicksburg, on the river side of Vicksburg, or did they actually go all the way around Vicksburg?
That's a good question. They didn't quite extend all the way around Vicksburg. They began almost adjacent to the river. I mean, they're not going to go right through the river bank, but as close as the high ground approach to the river on the north of Vicksburg, and they extended around down the east side to maybe the southeast, but directly south of Vicksburg remained open, but it was not an effective exit for Pemberton. Had Pemberton marched that way, he would have been very rough and broken country, directly into the sharp angle formed by the junction of, I think, the Big Black and the Mississippi, and he would have been trapped. So I'm sure that every day of the siege, Grant hoped and prayed that Pemberton would try to escape by marching due south along the Mississippi River. But I don't think he ever expected that Pemberton would. And we'd have
There's not much evidence of the trenching left there, I'm assuming.
to the south.
Yeah,
Not too much.
yeah. Well, thank you.
Dr. Woodworth, just a quick comment. Being having a sister that went to TCU, I'll make sure to keep her away from other Baylor alumnus just to make sure to keep her safe if it's that dangerous, as you say. But my question for you is, how did you come to find that those regular approaches in close contact created such high desertion rates? I mean, were you able to find any of those numbers within the Confederate ranks?
No, I haven't really been able to crunch that. It's basically my process of reasoning is this. May 19th to May 22nd, Confederate morale was high, and they were repulsed the assault. Morale in some units remained high throughout. Cockrell's Missouri Brigade. But some units seemed to decline during the course of the siege. Now, undoubtedly, several factors did come into effect. Hunger from short rations, perhaps loss of hope as the siege dragged on. I don't want to discount those. But I think the steady approach of Union troops, which would have been part of the reason for loss of hope, that they repulsed an assault on the 22nd of May, but by the end of June, Union troops are close enough that an assault almost could not be repulsed. So I think that the loss of hope was exacerbated by the steady advance of Union siege lines. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Well, it's not quite like looking at a sea of faces. It's like looking at a sea of ocean.
Could I ask a question? This is Doreen. I'm reading your Army of the Tennessee right now, and I'm really learning a lot. I know it's a subject tonight, but when the Tennessee River goes south, is that going up the Tennessee? You know what I'm saying?
Yes, ma'am, for sure. The Tennessee River from its mouth at Paducah on the Ohio, if you go south on it, I actually had the privilege of, I wasn't going south, I was going north on a riverboat a few years ago, and that was awfully nice. But if you were to travel from Paducah southward, you'd be going upstream of the Tennessee. Tennessee, if you continued southward on it, let's say you were in a canoe and you could get through, you could go on any shallowness of water. You'd make a big curve through northern Alabama. You'd come by and you'd touch Huntsville. Yeah, and then you curve back up past Chattanooga, wind up, if you were going upstream in your you'd be in East Tennessee going northeast from Chattanooga. But that wasn't navigable to the gunboats and transports they were using. The stretch we're talking about from the Army in Tennessee, it flowed north, and when you go south, you're going upstream.
I really appreciate that explanation. That's what I was thinking. Thank you.
Great. I saw another question that was texted, but I can't see it now.
We've got a couple of them in the chat area there. I'll just go ahead and read out the next one on here. How did the idea come about to tackle this as a topic for a book?
Well, that's a good question. We were, this particular one, we were just marching through campaigns in the Western Theater. And so kind of said, Chuck and I would kind of say, well, what campaign should we do next? And we knew we wanted to do several volumes on Vicksburg because there was so much to it. There was the maneuver campaign. We did a volume on that. There was the siege. Someday I'd like to do a volume. And by the way, Chuck is handing off his duties as assistant editor to Jonathan Stepley. So I'll have a new assistant editor. But anyway, I'd like to do a volume on the winter campaigns and the efforts at Lake Providence and so forth. There's so much interesting stuff that went on in the Vicksburg campaign. So I just wanted to cover this, and I thought there were more interesting things to do. Having gone through, the Vicksburg with the Army of the Tennessee when I was writing that book, I thought, there's more that can be dug out, more interesting stuff that can be done, and so that's why I picked this.
This is Michael Odonino. I apologize for getting into the game late. I had assumed that I was going to be back from a particular client obligation, but I couldn't. But I wanted to ask you, what's your next book?
Okay, well, there's several answers to that. Okay. So in this series, we're working on a book on the Fort Henry and Fort Donelson campaigns. We have some of the chapters in, and frankly, we need to chivvy the rest of the authors into getting their chapters finished as soon as possible and get that one put together. It'll probably be, realistically, by the time you get the chapters together, get them edited, get them sent to the press, and it goes through the process, it's a good year and maybe year and a half. And you see that one. Meanwhile, I'm working on writing a book of my own, Grant and the Virginia campaigns, from the wilderness to Appomattox. That's a lot of fun. I'm just following Grant there as if it were a giant chapter in a damn Grant biography and trying to do everything from the perspective of what did Grant know and when did he know it.
Also, normally I would do this as part of the introduction, but because of my late arrival, I'm going to do it now anyway, and that is to share with the audience some of the rate my professors about Professor Woodworth that I usually do as part of an introduction. And I think you'll find them interesting. It says, he's outstanding, incredibly helpful, pushed me to do more than what I thought I could ever do, demanding but a true scholar. It says, he is one of my favorite professor at TCU, very energetic, makes class fun. Another one, absolutely the best I've had. And then the rating drops a little bit here, Professor Woodworth. It says probably one of the best 3 history professors I've had. So, that's not bad though.
I'm thankful for it.
But my favorite rating is this one. Great professor. If you don't pay attention, the lectures are boring. But if you do pay attention, they're very exciting. So I think if everybody was paying attention tonight, they would agree with that rating.
Well, good. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, and thank you so much for coming and for doing this. We're so grateful because both times you've spoken in person, you got rave reviews, and I'm sure the same will be true again tonight. So,
thanks for having me. My pleasure.
We do have another question in the chat area. Was there a top-down approach to prevent fraternization during the siege? Did Army Corps or divisional commanders become involved, or was this primarily limited to regimental or company commanders?
Good question. The only in cases that I've encountered, it was all a matter of regimental officers. So colonel and down who were interfering with that, but they may have had orders from higher up. I haven't really checked that. From the Union point of view, it was really not to the Union's interest to stop fraternization for the most part. It was very much to the interest of the Confederacy to stop fraternization, and they didn't get it done.
Why was there that difference?
Well, because the Confederacy needed to, basically fraternization provided cover for the Union to dig their trenches back closer and closer to Confederate fortifications. So a nice quiet battlefield with nobody shooting at anybody was exactly what the Union wanted in the nighttime.
Are you going to be focusing further on the strategies that Grant had when he tried to find a way around Vicksburg off the river, up the Yazoo? My thinking is there was a lot of bog area there that they had a very difficult time trying to even get canoes up, let alone anything else. And there was a point in time when he finally gave up on that, I think, and tried some other strategy. I was very impressed with his strategy elsewhere. And I was wondering if you had worked on a book or a chapter dealing with his experiences in that area just east of Vicksburg.
Yes, indeed. If I live long enough, and I hope to, I don't know how long you get. Sometimes these books are all slow processes. I mean, my doctor says I'm in good shape, but these books take a long time. But anyway,
not my age. I'm 79, so you got a ways to go.
I've got ways to go for that. So I hope to be doing as well as you are in another 20 years. But no, I do hope to do that topic. I'd like to get together a volume of essays, and I think we could do a good volume of essays on things like the Yazoo Pass expedition, the Sunflower Creek expedition, the Lake Providence effort, and possibly the canal. I think that it might be interesting to bring out some new aspects of that. You know, Grant said at the time, well, no, not at the time. He said in his memoir, he never had much hope that those would work. And,
I know.
You know, it's like, well, I got to try something. One thing, Grant believed it was bad for soldiers to be idle, just to sit in their tents.
Oh, yeah.
He's probably right. Just sitting in their tents, especially in that winter. It was a nasty, cold, wet winter by the standards of colder and wetter than I think winters are there now. And so he didn't want them to be idle. He had to do something. I think some of it was to kind of to keep Lincoln happy. And then Grant also, I think one of the things about the way Grant made war, he was the kind of guy to throw a flurry of punches, and he didn't care which one of them got through as long as one of them landed. So I think he was willing to try these, and maybe not super optimistic that any of them worked, but if one of them showed some promise, he'd be glad to follow up on it and make the most of it.
Yeah, Grant was the impetus of Sherman's march all the way down. I mean, he was not willing to sit and watch things kind of sitting idle. He had to move day and night, and that's what he did. And certainly Sherman did that when he went all the way down through Atlanta to Savannah. Didn't rest at all. He drove the Confederates nuts.
Yeah. Well, if you think about it, that's probably some kind of universal principle of conflict. Think of a chess game, and think what will happen to you if you decide to start moving your knight back and forth, you know, aimlessly, and you just give the other guy all that tempo, and he can set up his position. He's going to crush you if he's any kind of a good player at all. And Grant was very much aware, I think maybe more than any other general in the war, Grant had a keen sense of the value of time. And you don't give your enemy the gift of time.
Timing was everything for Grant.
Professor, what was the most startling insight you gained from this book, in doing this book?
It's interesting. I recently did a interview for Chris Alvarez's podcast, and he asked pretty much the same question, and I had the same answer. I don't know if I'd say that any of the things that we found were startling and shocking. Grant was still a good general. The Confederates still lost, you know, the things like that. But I would say that there were things that were interesting, not things that you said, oh, wow. Things, for example, in my chapter, you know, it really looked like the progress of the siege works. As they get closer, the closer they get, the lower Confederate morale. And Nathan's right. It'd be nice to quantify the dates on which these soldiers come over, and then maybe, and this is yeah. So here you go, any grad students listening to this, Nathan, and to maybe look at what time did Confederate soldiers come over from what points on the line, and what was the distance between the works at that point on the line at that time. and see if you could find some correlation. My fear is that we might not have enough data points to really make that kind of a study be meaningful, but it would be interesting. But anyway, that was interesting to me, that it seemed like as the siege went on, morale went down. And I think there were multiple factors from that. I don't think it was monocausal, but I think, so that was interesting. It was an interesting thing that we found.
That was planned, I think, by Grant. He moved so fast that the Confederate side didn't have a time to recover from the movements the Union troops were making. And this you can see clearly with Sherman as well. He didn't have time to sit still. He had seen plenty of examples of that with McCulloch and several other previous generals of the Army of the Potomac. So he had much to go on, and he wanted this whole thing to be over as quickly as possible, I would guess.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head there. That's exactly right.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this.
Thanks.
More insight into what happened at night.
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Well,
I was
thank you all for
getting some
coming.
audio. I was getting some audio feedback from people, so I've muted them individually while Dr. Woodworth is responding. If you do have a question, you may want to unmute yourself again. Otherwise, I don't know. If we how long we're continuing here, Michael or Dr. Woodworth.
Yeah, I think if there are any other questions, let's have them now. But I certainly appreciate Professor Woodworth coming and sharing his valuable time with us. Much later for him in Texas than it is here. We miss having him in person, but we certainly have benefited greatly from this presentation this evening. Did anybody else have any questions?
I only had one comment. My wife is from Oklahoma, and of course she's OU, a Sooner. And she oftentimes talks about the rivalry, Red River rivalry with Texas, but she also knows about the other issue at TCU as well as Baylor. Every time they meet on the battlefield called the football field.
Yeah, I don't think Professor Woodworth really follows football very much. I'm kidding.
No, not at all. Go Frogs.
well, thank you very much, Professor Woodworth. We are so grateful. And
can I answer a question real fast?
Sure.
Hi, I very much enjoy your books. I just wanted to ask you, I know that the Vicksburg Command had close contact with General Johnson and Jefferson Davis and communicating with them all the time. How did he do that? Was he using wires? Why wasn't the Union cutting them? Was he using boats? How did he keep in contact, such close communication with the outside world?
Runners.
That's a good question. And that did happen at night. Now, it wasn't maybe super close, but on a number of occasions, messages were smuggled through. And what it comes down to is that an individual man, or even sometimes several, but with a message, it'd just be one man by himself. If he's got some skills and if he plays it smart, he can usually get through those lines. For example, that open area on the south end of the line, taking an army in there would be vital. An individual can get through there. So individuals can get through. The thing that Confederates tried to do during the fighting, they were short of percussion caps, the primers. Today you have a cartridge of primers in the base of the casing, but they were short primers and they needed them, and so they tried to smuggle those in at night. Sometimes they made it through, sometimes they got caught, but that would be maybe 10 or 12 men with large backpacks, like 25,000 primers in each one, trying to get through. And there was at least one group of those who got caught and were captured by the Union. But individual couriers almost always did.
Thank you. I've always wanted to know that. No one ever said that specifically how they did that. Thank you.
Pleasure.
I don't think they used pigeons in those days.
No, not that I know of. I'm not aware of it.
They would have been eaten by the Confederates if they had.
Exactly. Yeah, agree. Fried pigeon.
Well, unless there are any other questions, Professor Woodworth, thank you so much for taking the time. We really appreciate it. You did a fantastic job as usual. And can we get you back when you get your grant book out?
Yeah,
That would be great, and I'll hope I get a trip out to California out of it then.
That would be great. We'd love to
Good.
see you again.
Okay.
David,
All right.
it's on to you now. David, it's all yours.
You're for
Yeah, I think we're done.
Okay, we'll go ahead and end it here. I want to say thank you very much, Dr. Woodworth. It's been a pleasure working with you, and I really appreciate the time that you've given us here this evening. I did record this, so we'll upload that. I'll send it over to Michael probably tomorrow, so we can post it onto the website. But thanks, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Have a good evening to all. Thanks, Professor.
Hi, everyone.
Say good evening to Leah for me.
Will do.
All right.
Okay.
Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.